I mean, Margaret Thatcher, first ever female Prime Minister, longest-serving Prime Minister of the 20th century. For those two achievements alone, you would think her hometown could probably stretch to putting a statue up without too much outrage.
You certainly would think that. And I think sensible arguments about her and a statue should be sort of phrased in the context of history and of solid achievement. Now, I'm sure you'll hear from George Galloway the arguments for sort of the partisan politics of yesterday. But really looking for future generations' sense of history, of course Margaret Thatcher should have a statue. And in her hometown too.
What would you say are her main achievements, which are worthy, other than the two statistical facts about her, what are the main achievements of the Thatcher premiership which you think warranted?
Well, I think the biggest thing, she brought Britain back from a terrible low point of really collapse of a nation.
The point remains, doesn't it? She is a historical figure, whether you loved her or you loathed her.
Well, leave that to history. There are tens of millions of people still alive in Britain today who suffered. He mentioned pain. The pain was felt not by her or, with respect, people like Jonathan, rich people, filthy rich people. The pain was felt by poor people.
He's not filthy. He may be rich. He's not a filthy man.
He's not at all filthy, but he is filthy rich. Trust me on that.
Are you filthy rich, Jonathan?
She already...
I don't think he is.
George, there's plenty of working-class people who also see what Margaret Thatcher did as pretty groundbreaking, extraordinary, enabled them to own their own home, for instance.
Well, put it up in Barnsley, put it up in South Wales, put it up in the post-industrial Britain that she left literally as a human slag heap. She tore the country apart.
Well, no one's suggesting that we put the statue up in those places, but put it up in her hometown of Grantham, where it would be historically relevant in its own right.
This is a matter for private devotion. Jonathan can have his shrine indoors in Belgravia to Margaret Thatcher. He can worship the artefacts like the one behind me. He can...
The one you're referring to is the spitting image puppet, famous puppet of
I think George will probably bid for it before we leave the station.
Because it's up for auction.
I might, actually.
This is a matter of private devotion. It's a provocation to tens of millions of people.
Why have George, if tens of millions of people hated her so much, why did she keep being re-elected?
Well, she won on 43% of the vote at her pomp.
But she won.
The majority was always against her, even in her biggest days of
but now you sound like Hillary Clinton. I won the popular vote. Well, that's not how the elections work.
She certainly lost the popular vote, so don't imply that the majority of people ever supported her.
Margaret Thatcher, I would argue, is as popular with those who loved her and admired her as she is hated by...
But let them privately worship her.
But why? We have statues to all sorts of divisive people. Well, let me bring Jonathan back. I mean, there's a lot of hypocrisy, I think, on the left, with respect to George, that they idolise a lot of... I mean, we hear at the moment all the debate over what's happening in Venezuela, for example. You know, if it was left to Jeremy Corbyn, he'd have a statue to the outgoing, incredibly dysfunctional, unsuccessful leader, probably have a statue to him replacing one.
He wouldn't, you know.
He probably would, actually.
No.
But my point being...
Mandela, he supported building a statue to Mandela. There are some people that traverse political division.
No, I get
Margaret Thatcher is not one of them.
I get it, but actually, what's interesting, Mandela there, let's take Mandela. I had the pleasure of meeting him, interviewing him briefly. Remarkable man, icon of the last century, certainly, and much of this century. But many people who hate Mandela will say he was a terrorist, he was violent, he was racist, and so on. You can argue, we had this debate about Churchill last week.
Winston Churchill.
No one's perfect. If you become a world leader of any stature, I think you attract as much hatred as you do love. Margaret Thatcher, to me, whether you loved or hated her, was a strong leader,
our first female Prime Minister,
woman, who a trailblazer for women's rights in this country in many ways by becoming the first Prime Minister. And this is her hometown. It'd be like someone complaining about a statue to be in my village. It's the only place where they probably like me.
There probably would be protests, to be fair.
You're doing my job for me very well, but there's one thing I think we're leaving out of this argument. And if Margaret Thatcher was here, she'd love this good old ding-dong this argument. But there's one winning card, which is, I think George is talking hot air, really about a minority position, which is far smaller than he seems to think.
Right.
And there's one good reason I believe that. last time I was in the studio, I was on my way to Margaret Thatcher's funeral. And everybody, psyched up by the media and by the Georges of this world, said there's going to be terrible trouble. You know, there's going to be riots.
Yeah, and there wasn't, was there?
And the Metropolitans didn't make a single arrest. And I always remember, as that funeral ended in St Paul's Cathedral, there was a roar coming out from the crowd. And all of us in the cathedral thought, my goodness, that's the demonstrators, that's the hostiles. Far from it, the crowds were cheering. And I think of course, if you go to some mining town where there are still people who resent very much, you'll find a few, and you find sort of George, an old dinosaur of the left.
Liverpool was celebrating her
about
death.
16 people.
Liverpool,
they had the greatest
industrial Britain, was and still is deeply scarred.
Did you celebrate her
this
death?
woman? No, I didn't. But the division that she caused when she was alive should not. We've got enough divisions in Britain at the moment. The country is split down the middle on Brexit and the rest. But you know, statues are very last century. In fact, probably the century before that.
I'd like a statue.
She has a monument.
Yeah.
His name is Tony Blair. He's her monument. In fact, Mrs. Thatcher's ideas are still in power today. They've never been altered. So why build a provocation 10 feet high? The only safe place...
Oh, George, she's a historic figure.
If they were putting it up in, you know, the north of England, in one of the industrial places you're talking about, where there is a lot of ill feeling against it, it's indisputable.
No one's
then I would get all this antipathy. But to put one in Grantham, where she came from...
outside the grocer's shop.
I suspect the vast majority of people in Grantham probably are very proud of the fact the first female Prime Minister came from their town.
Why 10 feet high, then?
Huh?
Well, but in case...
You know why? To stop idiots defacing it and putting graffiti on it. Yeah. That's why. Yeah. That's why.
It would be good for tourism in Grantham and not in a good way.
Final word, Jonathan?
Well, let her have her statue. History deserves it.
I agree.